Yes, so good evening and a warm welcome to all our participants here in the room as well as in front of the screens to our annual Transatlantic Security Dialogue. My name is Renate Tembusch and I am the director of the EU office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung here in Brussels. So, in particular, I would like to welcome, first of all, our delegation from the other side of the Atlantic. And we have with us here today, and for the next couple of days, Victoria Holt, Director of the Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Security. We have Ambassador Daniel Shields, visiting policy practitioner at the Ford School, Vice Diplomacy Center at the University of Michigan. Also part of the delegation is Michael Kimmich from the Catholic University, and he's a former member of the US State Department. Then we have Ambassador Daniel Baer, he's here on the panel, former US Ambassador to the OSCE and now working with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And last but not least, Heather Herbert, Herbert, I think I pronounced it wrongly now, the Director of Models of Policy Change at New America Foundation and an expert on foreign and security policy. As well, I would also like to welcome my colleagues from our Washington office, Knut Detlefsen and Michael Chagala. So, after last year, where we only could meet digitally and therefore had a very reduced exchange program due to the corona lockdown, we are more than happy to have you all here as a delegation from the US today, live and in color, as we say in Germany. The Transatlantic Security Dialogue program lasts several days and includes a full-day workshop, meetings with NATO and EU representatives, as well as this public panel discussion on new voices and new ideas, the United States, Germany, and Europe in the world, which is taking place actually here tonight with our high-level guests. And it is my special honor to welcome as our distinguished panelist, Ambassador Rüdiger König, here to my left, permanent representative of the Federal Republic of Germany on the North Atlantic Council. And I mentioned him before as part of the delegation, but also now our panelist, Ambassador Daniel Baer from US Ambassador to the, he's the former US Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And the discussion tonight will be moderated by Terry Schulz. Welcome to you also. She's a freelance reporter for National Public Radio, CBS News and Deutsche Welle, with a particular focus on NATO and European security and defense policy. Terry will soon introduce our guests again properly and also explain to you, our participants here in the room, as well as out there in the digital space, how to get involved into the debates later on. But before I hand over to our moderator, allow me just some few remarks. The title of our discussion today is New Voices and New Ideas, the United States, Germany, and Europe in the World. A broad field, to quote the famous German author Theodor Fontane. However, our ambition today, given the radically changed challenges facing the USA and Europe in the security era, is to dig deeper into this broad field and to really think ahead. In the face of a new era of global strategic and systemic competition, rearmament, a new nuclear armament spiral, and a broad range of new security threats like hybrid and cyber threats, but also climate and terrorism, to name only a few, but also as lesson learned from the experiences with military interventions from Vietnam over Iraq, Libya, Syria, to the most recent and most devastating in Afghanistan, we have to find new approaches, a new and fresh thinking, a thinking out of the box when it comes to security strategies and politics. With the new Biden administration in place, expectations on both sides of the Atlantic are high when it comes to the transatlantic European-US partnership. The Europeans have to step up their efforts and have to finally prove that they are able not only to develop new strategies, also to actually implement a common foreign and security policy in order to become the equal partner on eye level with the US in NATO as well as in the transatlantic partnership at large. At the same time, the US has to understand that the European security perception, in particular when it comes to Russia and China, but also when it comes to military interventions and security questions in a broader sense, is quite diverse, and the debates are quite complex between the member states as well as on the national levels. In particular, in Germany, the debate on security and defense issues is extremely controversial. We are aware that our American friends are watching us closely and are skeptical about what to expect from the new SPD-led government when it comes to these issues. Foreign and security policy didn't play a prominent role in the national elections, and the so-called Sondierungspapier didn't say much about what to expect from the new traffic light coalition government in this area. Therefore, I would say it is even more timely and important to have this kind of direct dialogue in order to build trust, to exchange and analyze the various different perspectives, and to find and further develop common grounds that help to strengthen the transatlantic partnership. If there's one lesson to learn from the period under the Trump administration, and I have to mention this, then it is that we can't take the transatlantic dialogue and partnership for granted. Therefore, we have to make sure that the dialogue is based on a broad and very solid and unshakable ground on many levels, so that it can survive any future government that is hostile to the transatlantic partnership and multilateralism, be it on our side or on the other side of the Atlantic. I also truly believe that we have to broaden up this discourse and to carry it into the broader public space if we want to find new voices and new ideas on this very important issue that so far is mainly discussed among a small and unfortunately not very diverse and still very much male-dominated institutional expert elite. We as Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, in particular our offices in Berlin, Brussels and Washington, together with our partners in Europe and the US, will continue to work on this. The transatlantic dialogue is an established forum that will be continued and accompanied by various additional exchange programs on issues beyond security like digitalization, climate, trade or gender and diversity questions. So, having said this, I would like to thank everybody, the audience for their interest and participation, the panelists and the moderator, our delegation from the US, as well as the members of our Washington and Brussels teams, led by our program managers Sidonie Wetzig and Michael Chogalla, who made all this possible. They organized it. And yeah, now I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm handing over to Terry. Thanks again, and Terry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Renate, and thanks to all of you in the room as well as those joining us out there online. You will also have a chance to participate. I think actually you gave quite good introductions to my two guys here. Just a couple of notes I would add. Ambassador Koenig also served as German ambassador to Afghanistan, which has resulted in us having very heated discussions between the two of us about US and European policy, and we will get into more of that tonight. And also a funny note, Dan Baer, now that I know that Heather Hurlbert is in the room, we actually covered the OSCE back when it was the CSCE. This is, yep, we're old hands at this, so I'm sure Heather will come up with some good questions for you. But I would like to get right into our discussion. And Dan also said, and I know the ambassador is the same way, that we are most interested in taking questions. But I would like to give you first the opportunity to make some opening remarks. You know, for those of us who were here in Europe when the Obama administration took over, Ambassador, it was not really unexpected that when Joe Biden came to office, there would be this irrational exuberance among Europeans, like there was with Obama when those days we thought were dark days for the transatlantic relationship were over. That was true again, and again, there were disappointments, perhaps even more sharply than in the early days of the Obama administration with the Joe Biden presidency. So do you think that Europe set its sights too high? And, everybody even told themselves, don't overestimate that things will, become easy again immediately. But nonetheless, did Europe think that it was going to be smoother sailing than it ever could have been?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and thank you that I can be here with you. And well, to answer your first question, I think yes, you're right. High expectations, new administration after 4 years of difficult transatlantic relations. Joe Biden, or the President of the United States, of course, is not an unknown personality, and wasn't an unknown personality in Europe, or in Berlin for that matter. So we knew more or less what to expect. And the expectations were, yes, we will enter into a different phase of the transatlantic relations with that new administration. However, in our analysis, it was not, and not in any way, the case that we thought, well, now all problems are gone. That, let's say, the difficult strategic questions, how do we go about China, how do we go about Russia, will not simply go away. So I think the level of disappointment is limited, at least from my point of view.
Yes, but you're German. I mean, you don't. You just don't tell us.
No, actually, I mean, as I said, if you look back to the Obama administration, where Joe Biden was vice president, and if I look to whatever the vice president at that time officially stated in speeches, in articles, or whatsoever, it is no surprise to us that this administration is more or less going back to the Asia-Pacific, because that was also in the Obama administration at least a strategic goal, probably not as fully followed up as we expected back then, but Joe Biden was very clear on this, that he would set his eyes on the Asia-Pacific. Secondly, one of your favorite subjects, I know. If you look what Joe Biden said 2009 about us staying in Afghanistan or ending that mission, he was very clear in 2009 already that he said, yeah, probably we should end that mission in Afghanistan. So it's no surprise that this new administration is following up that course, and otherwise he didn't have any other alternative after the Trump-Taliban agreement anyway. So that's why I say that there is no disappointment that we still have to discuss these strategic questions with the U.S. administrations very seriously. We did not expect that we would agree on everything. And that was never the case. I think somewhat we are idealizing the transatlantic relations. They have always been lively in a way, and that's good.
That's
and they have always been critical in a way. And that's what the alliance is actually doing and has been doing in the past 70 plus years, is balancing the different views between European allies, the United States, Canada, and it was never happy-go-easy. And it's not happy-go-easy now. We are discussing difficult questions.
There are people who said there were alternatives to the way President Biden ended the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and you can't pretend people weren't surprised by the way it ended, with the pullout, with the rejection of the European request to stay just a few more days to help with evacuations. People were surprised. Ursula von der Leyen, Josep Borrell expressed their disappointment and shock. So maybe you, in your office, were not disappointed or surprised, but there are people who openly said they were.
Yes, but I mean, to the defense of the decision that has been made in Washington, many European allies would have liked to see a different decision, that's true. we would have liked to see exploring the possibility of a conditions-based withdrawal a little bit more intensively than we actually did, but because we at the end of the day we got a time-based decision. But from well, I'm not the U.S. president, of course. But if you look at the alternatives for the U.S. president, a conditions-based withdrawal would have had consequences. And I'm not sure, and there I wouldn't speculate, because probably that's better suited here. I'm not sure how much the U.S. American public would have followed such a course. And all politics is local in a way. So you have to take that into account. And the conditions-based approach, obviously, that's my interpretation, was not an alternative, because probably too difficult, not easy to defend with the U.S. public. So what the president did, he stayed with the time-based decision his predecessor actually introduced in this Trump-Taliban deal.
And yet, for those who don't have the great privilege of covering NATO on a daily basis like I do, we should also point out that despite the fact that Europeans would have liked a different timeline, a little bit slower withdrawal, from what I'm told, nobody stood up in the meetings and said, we want to stay longer. No one.
Yeah, because I think, talking about lessons learned, I think for the Europeans, that decision was also a wake-up call. Because if you realize that even if we would have wanted to stay longer, we couldn't.
That's right.
Because we are so much depending on U.S. assets that we, as Europeans, would have not been in a position to do that, because we simply don't have the means. And that corresponds a little bit with the introductory remarks that Europe has to find not only its role, but has to reinvigorate its capabilities and capacities. And only then you have a real alternative. Because it was always clear that once the Americans, as we always say, once the US leaves, we will leave. And that was clear for the past 20 years.
Reinvigorate your capacities being a euphemism.
Yeah, I mean...
in some cases, it's creating capacities as the EU is going to do now.
The Europeans
theoretically
simply don't have, or some capacities are simply non-existent in Europe. However, let's not forget, since 2014, the European defense budgets have been increasing year by year by year. We are certainly not there yet if it comes to capabilities. We still have lots of things to do. But at least there is an investment into defense and security, which hasn't been the case before 2014. Sure. Where we all were in a different phase. But since 2014, the security environment in Europe has changed fundamentally. And we all agreed in this famous Wales NATO summit to increase our defense spending. And that's actually what we did.
Sure. Okay, so this is a good transition into Dan. So the Afghanistan situation, the withdrawal, which made many Europeans very unhappy and very uncomfortable, it really did, in a way I have not seen in the 15 years I've lived here, light a fire under the discussion about increasing the EU's capabilities, which then, of course, then the US comes back and says, oh, but it can't duplicate, and you know, the US is of sort of two minds about the EU creating its own independent military capacity under European Union auspices. You've worked with the European Union, you've worked with NATO. Tell me what the view is from Washington on, yes, Europe needs to become more capable, but not in a way that would suck any resources away from NATO. Is that's still the view in Washington?
Well, I can only speak for myself, not for official, lest my colleagues or my former colleagues who are now back in the administration chastise me for pretending to speak for them. But I think in general, there's strong support for developing more capacity, whatever that's a euphemism for in Europe. Although I would note that in addition to it being true that nobody stood up, not only did they not have capacity, which is actually debatable. There are European actors who do have the capacity to keep a reasonable sized force. There are. It's also that nobody wanted to commit an extra 10 or 20,000 soldiers, which the choice of a conditions-based withdrawal was not, can we stick around until the status quo gets better? It was the status quo is going to get much worse and is going to require much more force on the ground in order for us to have the same level of control. And so it was not a we'll stay longer. It was we'll stay and we'll add more in, and nobody wanted to do that. And that's a question of political will as much as it is of capacity. But I do think that there's strong support in Washington for developing capacity in Europe, and I think the question is really about duplication and making sure interoperability is not harmed by capacity. And there are arguments on both sides of the Atlantic, both of which are meritorious, about sometimes people dressing up industrial policy as strategic and vice versa. And I think we need to be frank and honest with each other about where the most effective investments are in both sides of the Atlantic in developing our capacity, because neither of us actually has resources to spare, and we both depend on each other. And that is part of the recognition that is happening across the board right now.
And you think that that's some of the discomfort about that the U.S. expresses now that the EU is talking more seriously about developing its own military elements? You think that they're worried that they won't buy U.S. so much?
I believe that is a perception in Europe. And I have not heard that from any of my colleagues in the U.S. My colleagues in the U.S. are focused on making sure that we don't do anything to damage the interoperability goals of NATO, that we don't undermine the NATO strategic concept, and that the EU and NATO are able to interact in a way that makes sense. And so there's great interest in Washington in seeing a more robust kind of framework of cooperation between the EU and NATO, especially if the EU is going to develop its own set of capacities, so that those things are not duplicative and that there's a common understanding of how those things might be deployed in the future. I know that from a European perspective, there is often an accusation or a suspicion or skepticism that U.S. interest in seeing the European investment in defense increase is partly U.S. industrial policy. I've never heard that be a motive in a policy discussion, public or private, in the United States, but I know that that's a perception. I think by the same token, on the U.S. side, one can see President Macron's deep interest in strategic autonomy as partly a strategic conversation and partly a French industrial policy conversation. And I think there are people on both sides who have that suspicion of the other, which makes it really important that we speak honestly and openly with each other.
To broaden this back out a little bit, because I feel self-serving in talking about Afghanistan so much and NATO, do you feel that, having been in the Obama administration, where you were welcomed with such open arms by the United States, by the European Union, and by European allies, I mean, did you feel that were you watching sort of the expectations for the Biden administration and thinking, hold your horses, Europe?
I think, first of all, the ambassador is quite right. We've always had, I mean, in some sense, the sign of a deep friendship is the ability to have ongoing arguments and still be friends. And we've had that for decades, and I'm very grateful as an American that that's true, because I think there is always, for the rest of my lifetime, the most important ongoing friendships in the world for the United States will be with our democratic partners around the world, most of whom are on the other side of the Atlantic. And we do not always agree, but we have a common ideal and commitment to values that allows us to discuss tactics in the interim where we might disagree. And I was, probably sharper on Russia than many of my German counterparts and colleagues during the Obama administration would have liked. And I never thought that we weren't trying to get to the same point. I just thought we had different interpretations of the best way of getting there. So I don't think it was all happy-go-lucky in the Obama administration either. I do think that when we stand back 20, 30 years from now, we will see, I hope, I should say, the best version of the world that I can imagine 20 or 30 years from now is that when we stand back and look at what the last 5 years have been, including the first 6 months of the Biden administration. We will see the Trump era as a wake-up call. We will, yes, see that there was an irrational or hopeful but delusional expectation on both sides that we might be able to just go back to the way times were before. But you can't turn back clocks. And hopefully what happens is that Chancellor Merkel said something the other day that really resonated with me and reminded me of a conversation long ago listening to NPR with my dad in the car, and somebody mentioned family money. And I said, what is family money?
Your dad's like, nothing, son, nothing.
Can we have some? He explained what the concept meant, and he said, you know, there's a theory that the first generation makes it, the second generation keeps it, and the third generation loses it. And more, I feel like that same framework applies to politics, and politics at the highest level, international politics. The generation that saw what happened in World War II understood how precious our institutions are, how fragile they are, and what happens when they fall apart. And they built both domestically and internationally, a framework of institutions that could imperfectly but continuously work towards supporting peace and prosperity for the transatlantic community and increasingly for the world. That generation built it, the second generation kept it, and our generation is at risk of losing it. And if we're smart, we'll recognize that the pessimism we felt in the last few years is cause for us to look for opportunities for renewal. And I think we are at a generation defining, you know, maybe it's not a once in 75 years turning point, but we are definitely at a once in 30 years turning point right now. And the pessimism that we feel about certain aspects of the world or the transatlantic relationship, once we go through the stages of grief and acknowledge that we can't go back and turn back time, we should embrace the fact that this is actually an opportunity to build whatever's coming next. And increasingly that is something that that has to be built on equal footing, because the United States can't do what it used to be able to do alone. For the next 20, 30 years, we won't be able to do that.
And doesn't want to.
And don't want to. And we will be more effective if we are working with partners. And neither the United States nor Europe can succeed in the next 30, 75 years without each other.
Well, that's a good place to launch it into our thinkers in the room. And I also want to mention to the people online that wherever you're following us, you should see on your screen a QR code. And by scanning that, you can get into the chat wall on whichever site you're looking. And you can pose questions there, and I'll be getting them on my phone. And in that way, you can participate with us. But I would like to start with our guests here in the room. Who would have questions for our panelists? Please stand up and give us your name and where you're from. And Heather, I know you have some.
Well, Terry, thank you so much.
You've got a mic coming.
So I'm Heather Hurlbert from New America in Washington, and Terry and I were impossibly young and naive when we got to know each other at the Helsinki Summit in 1992. And I've been thinking, since you were so kind as to mention
how old we are,
that if you had said, you know, of all the things, if you had said to 1992 Heather and Terry about 2022 Heather and Terry and transatlantic relationship, and I was thinking one thing that has changed much less than I think 1992 Heather thought it would is that the agonizing process of European coordination still looks an awful lot to 2022 Heather like 1992 Heather. And so and this is, to be frank, something that our friends in Washington are really struggling with. So Europe, you say you want to be more united, you say you want to do more, and then we look at you and ask you to do something. And so Dan, I was curious for your sort of take on the historical arc, what you see now as opposed to what you saw 5 years ago. And Ambassador, I was curious to hear from you the kind of hopeful case of where this is going and what Washington could do, if anything, in the short time horizon that Terry also alluded to help Europe be the kind of peer, actor, and partner that it wants to be and that Washington on our best days wants it to be.
Yeah, is that frustration you were talking about before your interagency process or after?
Astonishingly similar.
Well, it's always somewhat strange if NATO people talk about the European Union. That's always suspicious. But I try to.
I very carefully said European coordination.
I believe that. Yeah, I believe that European coordination has always been somewhat difficult, and I think it will remain difficult because it is. A group of democratic countries with a common, not always happy history amongst each other. And it's as much as it is difficult to find consensus in NATO, it is difficult to find consensus in the European Union or in Europe. For that matter. I strongly believe that the developments in Europe will, over time, I wouldn't speculate how long it will take, will over time, step by step, contribute to a more capable, more independent Europe, and for that matter, European Union, which will have repercussions on the transatlantic relationship. And the question will be, how do we actually steer that process, that the transatlantic relation, which is and will remain, regardless how independent or powerful or whatever Europe will ever be, will still be indispensable. But of course, the balance and the relation will change, and it has always changed, as we have said, and it will change in the future as well. The whole debate about European autonomy, there is a kind of ambiguity about the term autonomy. There are different interpretations also among European Union members, but I think somehow it shows the direction the Europeans would like to go, but without sacrificing the transatlantic relationship to it, because we are in a fundamentally changing security environment where a immensely strong superpower like the US is telling me we can't do the same things we could do, let's say, 10 years ago. That is certainly true for Europe as well. And Europe will have to find its place in that changing security environment. Now I speak for Germany, of course. We do not believe that Europe as such will be in a position to go it alone. We will need partners in that changing security environment, and the most natural partner is sitting right there. Do we have any other else? I don't think so. Here it is where we share values. Here it is where we share a long history of cooperation and friendship, for that matter. So we will see a different Europe with hopefully also different capabilities and capacities. We will be seeing a changing, but hopefully still strong transatlantic relationship, because we simply need each other. The challenges are simply too big for us to deal with them single-handedly. And we will have to recalibrate and rebalance that relationship. And not only because I'm sitting here, but I would tell you the same if every camera is off or so. I am very optimistic that we will, at the end of the day, achieve what I have been talking about now. It will be difficult, and we will have difficulties, and probably we will fight over issues. But I think that this community of values of various forms of democracies, who all are different. Our democracy is different from the US, how it is organized. But this fundamental base of belonging to one family, I think, is still strong enough in the third generation as well. It will be different, but the family money is still there.
The two things, I mean, your question is an interesting one, because I was saying that things have changed since 1992, but what has changed since 2016? I think the two things that are most different, and that's not to and maybe both of these should have been recognized in 2016. But the two things that are most different, one is that even if there's a continuity between the US focus on Asia under the Obama administration and today, the so-called pivot to Asia, which then was bothering Europeans because I would hear people saying, you no longer care about Europe. And I kept saying, this isn't some kind of geopolitical infidelity. It's that for the last, after the end of the Cold War, we were very focused on integrating other Europeans who had been on the wrong side of a divide into the democratic and free world. And that work is largely complete. And the next area of opportunity in the project that we share is to knit other people into that. And we turn not away from you, but with you to other parts of the world. I think that we are no longer on offense in that sense. And that's perhaps bad wording, but we are definitely on defense. We are no longer in a period of expansion. We are in a period of trying to consolidate gains that we have. And I think the broader recognition of that, and maybe I was just late to the game, but the broader recognition of that is something that I think has changed in the last 5 years. And then parallel to that at the domestic level, there was, even as we were talking about how oh, indeed, history hasn't really ended, and now we recognize that it's our task, it's our challenge to define how history will begin again. But even as we were recognizing 5 years ago that history hadn't really ended, we still believed that consolidated democracies were consolidated. And the serious threats to institutions and values that are happening in democracies on both sides of the Atlantic because of populism that is fueled by the failures of our democratic systems to provide, fueled in part by the failures of our democratic systems to provide a hopeful perspective for the next generation or two. That is something that I think, even if the warning signs were there, many of us didn't recognize 5 years ago the way that we recognize today.
Okay, thank you. And just a reminder to our online audience that you can join the question and answer session by scanning your QR code and posing your question on the chat wall. And also, you can join the conversation on Twitter at #SecTalkFES. So we very much want to continue this conversation online, even for those people who aren't in the room. I do have one question coming in from our online audience. Ambassador, the new coalition in Germany might have a different position on Russia and China, but will be divided on nuclear sharing. Will this complicate matters in NATO? The answer is yes, but...
Yes.
I have to. No, that makes it harder. He has to admit it.
I know that the person who is actually asking the question will be totally dissatisfied with my answer.
It's me, okay? It's me.
Because it is certainly interesting and energizing, but it's still speculating about a possible result which we don't know. It's ongoing discussions between three parties that are to form a government. For the first time in history, we will have a federal three-party government. We had three-party government in federal states, but never on the federal level. And these are three very different parties. And it was pointed out rightly that, as usual, foreign and security policy doesn't play a role in election campaigns. In most of our countries, it doesn't, but it does afterwards. And I think that's also the difference between a federal state three-party government and the federal government, because for the first time, these three parties have to discuss about foreign and security policy that you don't have to do when you are in North Rhine-Westphalia or someplace else. And but as I said, I would not speculate about any outcome of these discussions, because we are right in the middle of these discussions. And if you look into the respective election programs of the three parties, a discussion on nuclear sharing was unavoidable, because we have at least one of the coalition partners that in their election program has been critical about it, and the second one, which is probably following up, it's the ban treaty. It's the same. So we'll have to find somehow a solution, and there are many, many, many possibilities how that solution would look like. Yes, to be a little bit, hopefully not too disappointing on this, a decision on not continuing with nuclear sharing, and again, I must say there are 10 different varieties how this could actually come about, but people only talk about one, that Germany is simply leaving. There are many, many other possibilities also. Of course, we'll be discussing this with our partners in NATO, and it will not go unnoticed, but I won't speculate about an outcome.
That's worst case scenario, right? It's a possibility.
Everything's possible. At the moment, in these coalition talks, I don't know. I'm not part of the coalition talks. Obviously, I'm not. Probably, if I were, I would be sitting there discussing these things. Everything is possible. I think the outcome is not yet determined. My speculation on my own is the coalition talks are organized for the time being in working groups of experts. And if the experts in the foreign and security policy working group will not come to a solution on this question, it will be hierarchically sent up to the party leaders, and then they will decide. Whether this will happen, I don't know. And when it will happen, I also don't know. It should be before the 6th of December, because that's the date the coalition partners have set for electing the new chancellor. And so, yeah, as I said, probably my answer is a little bit disappointing, but as I said, I think there is no point in speculating.
Oh, I think there's a lot of point in speculating.
Yeah, but I could give, let's say, 10 different varieties about which we speculate, and what would be the outcome, how would be the reaction in Washington to this possibility, to that, to this, to this.
Well, if I don't get more questions coming in online, I may come back to you on a few of those. I'd like to take another question from the room. Please, sir, introduce yourself.
Michael Kimmage, a professor of history at Catholic University and part of the U.S. delegation here. It's nice to hear the interplay of pessimism and optimism in your comments. It's a kind of richness, and with that in mind, I wanted to ask about Russia and China. When you look at these two countries, sort of where do you feel, if anywhere, optimistic? Where do you feel pessimistic? And by all means, feel free to speculate about the relationship between these two countries, which is really of the essence for the transatlantic relationship.
Have a limited level of being too optimistic in the for the near future, because as my colleague has been saying, and rightly so, I think that for whatever Germany and the United States, other European countries are standing for, is coming under pressure. the way we feel how a state should be organized, the way we feel how citizens should participate, the way we feel how we provide a choice for citizens, whatever they would decide to do in their lives, is coming under pressure. And there are two countries which put us under pressure. One is Russia and one is China, in very different ways. Because they are, in our view, there are two different countries. They are both autocratic, but have different possibilities. And again, I'm coming back to capabilities and capacities. So we also believe that the response we are giving to, if my theory is correct, that the two countries are different, we will have to give a different answer to the challenges we are facing with the two countries. I mean, for Russia, if we look back in the past 5, 6, 7 years, we are constantly faced with an assertive Russia. It is the Russia that has illegally annexed Crimea. It is the Russia that is certainly playing its role in eastern Ukraine, and so on and so on and so on. And China, I have to take recourse to how actually our colleagues in the European Union are describing China in their document. They say challenges, opportunities, and systemic rival. NATO actually in its official documents is not using the same language. I think we will develop our language towards China on our way to Madrid, but we are not talking in NATO about systemic rivalry. This is not, that's the European Union. But being also a country that is member of the European Union, I think the three words describe the relationship with China very good, and in a very good way. And we see that autocratic countries are trying to expand their influence more and more. That is, as I said, why also our ideals are coming under pressure, and I think we will, and I think we have to react to this with the whole toolbox that governments or alliances have at their disposal. I'm coming back to this always lively discussion, transatlantic discussion. We might not agree on using all the same tools all the time, but fortunately we have a big toolbox available, and I think that is what is happening. NATO, for that matter, we are right in the middle. Well, not really in the middle. In the first quarter of writing a new strategic concept. The old strategic concept we have is from 2010. And usually these strategic documents have a lifespan of about 10 years. And if you look into the strategic concept of 2010, you will see, and compare what is happening today, you will see a lot of changes that have been taking place in the past 10 years. And we will simply, I think not simply, but we will have to adapt NATO again, and all our countries again, to the new security challenges and new security environment. And we will have to define what is our relation as NATO with Russia. In the old strategic concept, Russia is viewed as a partner, as a strategic partner. I will again not speculate what the outcome of the new strategic concept will be, But it will be not easy to find a lot of arguments to keep up the strategic partnership. And China doesn't even figure in the old strategic concept. And we will have to define the role of NATO towards China as well. Usually people, or more often than not, people believe that it's some kind of expanding the area of responsibility of NATO into the South China Sea. That is not the thing we are discussing. But what we are discussing is how do we react if we have cyber threats? And we have them every day, in all our countries, every day. We are seeing cyber attacks. Some of them coming from Asia, some of them coming from the East. How do we react to this? On the other hand, everybody says, and rightly so, if we look to the global issues of climate and climate change, Glasgow is ongoing in the moment. Can we ever imagine to find a solution on climate change without China? Probably not. So we will have to give a balanced and different answer to this, but certainly Russia and China are two things which are more or less are crossing my desk every day.
Ambassador, just let me just interject on. I mean, Germany has been one of the countries that was viewed by the United States as the most wishy-washy on Russia and China, to be honest. I mean, have you seen the perception change? Chancellor Merkel is always seen as sort of trying to walk the line between seeing Russia and China as dangerous, you know, as rivals more than partners, and that has been something that the United States, more under the previous administration, pushed Germany to change its view on, with investments by China, with, I mean, Nord Stream. I mean, we can talk about different things that were controversial. They're controversial inside the EU. You have partners inside the European Union, inside NATO, who don't like the German position on Russia.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
And but let me talk from a NATO perspective and not venture into economic decisions.
That's because
like
they
Nord
complain
Stream.
less about it at NATO.
We have always advocated and continue to advocate that there is no, or hopefully not, at least in our view, there is no response to Russia which is only confrontational. We have always said we have to, of course, counter the threats which are coming from Russia, but we have also always said we have to be open for dialogue with them.
But you don't have to sign trade agreements with them. You don't have to have a pipeline with them.
Well, trade agreements are signed with other countries do that as well, and the trade relation between the U.S. and China is pretty substantial.
Fair.
And because this dual track, which has been NATO policy for 150 years, we would like to keep that because we truly believe that this is the way we should go about it. Not having a dialogue with your adversary, or however you would call Russia, would be a strategic mistake. And I wouldn't like, and we would not like to see to cut all the ties with Russia on this dialogue track. It's hard work to keep that up. It's the same with China. When we say challenges, opportunities, and systemic rival, the opportunities is dialogue. That has always been our policy, and I think it will continue to remain our policy to keep that dialogue channel open and to invite Russia to participate in that dialogue, which they haven't been doing in the past years. that makes our position a bit more difficult, because you're always confronted, of course, with the argument, yeah, but the Russians don't come.
Or they pick up from Brussels and leave.
Yeah.
Yes, or they pick up from Brussels
not coming
and leave.
anymore. Yeah,
And,
for sure.
but that does, for us, that's not a contradiction of the policy. Sometimes dialogue works better, sometimes it works less. And to this also is the component that we need a disarmament component, both with Russia, but also with China. And I think here we are not far away from the Washington position. They are also interested in having China as part of the disarmament setup, which is also difficult. But I mean, again, maybe I may sound a little bit, let's say, too relaxed about this, but times, apart from short periods, have always been difficult. And we have been seeing much more difficult times with the Russians in the past as well. I mean, the whole Cold War experience we all have. And also in the Cold War, there was always a channel of dialogue.
I don't think anybody's suggesting that you completely cut off dialogue. I mean, that's not a suggestion out of NATO or the EU or even the most hawkish voices. But on China, Dan, for example, the Trump administration truly bullied Europe, especially about the 5G question, and came over and threatened to cut off intelligence sharing with European allies if they continued using Huawei components in their 5G systems, for example. But were they right? I mean, many European countries have now, and the European Union itself has come around to some extent to the U.S. way of thinking that this is not a system that can work in democracies, that you can't use Chinese components in your telecommunication systems.
I mean, I think in any case we can say that the tactic was wrong. Whether the assessment was right is kind of an open question, and the fact that European countries are coming to that same conclusion on their own, I think, vindicates in some way the American concerns that have been offered. But if we step back, I want to pick up a little bit on the shutting down dialogue, because I think the real risk is that we democracies value dialogue so much because for us it is fruitful, and it is how we arrive at a contest of ideas, and we go back and forth and we debate and we argue and we hopefully come up with a better shared project. I think we can make that valuable and admirable attribute into an asymmetry that the Russians and the Chinese take advantage of. And when I totally support keeping dialogue open, but when they start to use dialogue as something that they know that you want or that we want, and they extract concessions in order for the sake of dialogue, then we're losing. Then we're not playing our cards right. And I think if we take another step back and look at the question asked about Russia and China, and it's really important to underscore the point that you made about the difference between the two. You know, Russia is a destructive power. My Russian counterparts in Vienna always used to say, Dan, we live in a multipolar world. And I would say, fine, I'll concede that we live in a multipolar world. What makes you think that Russia is a pole? Poles attract things to them. There's no attraction to the Russian model. Russia has, at least for the last 10 years, it has mainly exercised power by destroying things that matter to those of us who care about a rules-based order. And it destroys those things or threatens to destroy those things in order to extract concessions. And the challenge that I think Russia is going to have with that strategy is when, that strategy only works for as long as you think you can only kind of use crayon to draw on the living room walls for as long as you think that the living room walls will definitely not fall down. China is a much different kind of challenge. China is a challenge to the values underlying the rules-based order and to the order itself. And there's an alternate proposition that they are ready to put forward at the right time. And for that reason, coming to your interesting question about the relationship between Russia and China, there's a lot of talk that goes around about how we should try to peel them apart in some way in order to deal with we should deal with the threats or challenges that each of them poses, treat them as individual challenges, and we should trust that over the long run, there's natural tension in that relationship that is going to be difficult for both of them to manage. I'll finish with this. In 2014, I kept thinking, like, if you took a map of the world and took all the names of countries off of it and asked people, which country, these are the countries in a new world, which country should care the most about upholding the rules about the sanctity of borders? Russia has more borders with more unstable places than any other country, and they're the ones violating the rules about borders. It's completely insane unless you have such confidence that the rules-based system is going to stand forever and ever that you feel like you can afford to torch the house that you're living in. But at some point, there's going to be a tension for them that is really dangerous for their own strategic future, and I guess I hope that recognition is a peaceful one and one that can be negotiated, but I think that is coming.
Well, it's not a coincidence that some of those countries are unstable and they're right next to Russia.
Right.
I mean,
no,
come on.
Of course, they are unstable, not on accident, on purpose, because that has been part of it. But again, you have to believe, in some sense, they are parasitic on the system that we invest so much in, and their ability to exercise power only comes from the fact that we are so committed to that we respond to the threat they pose to it. And at some point, if they weaken it too much, they will no longer be able to exercise power. We will all be in a world of hurt. And I think, I think that is a tension that is coming. I also want to answer the question about what we're optimistic about. I am optimistic about the Russian people in the long run, and I am optimistic about the Chinese people in the long run. Those are the two things that I'm optimistic about in both of those relationships.
And neither are small populations.
No.
That's a good thing. I'm going to take a question from the chat wall. Where does the panel, did you want to say something else? No. Okay. You breathed in a way that made me think you wanted to talk.
Or continue.
I'm very sensitive moderator. Where does the panel see the future role of the UK in the triangle between London, Brussels, and Washington? Can we imagine European defense without coordinating mechanisms between the points of that triangle, I guess it means? So far, there are no such mechanisms outside of NATO after Brexit, with the EU, Washington, and the UK. How does the American administration evaluate this?
I think probably and here I am projecting onto this. This is my supposition, is that the American administration thinks two things. One, that we have a strong interest in there being strong ongoing cooperation both between the UK and individual countries in Europe, as well as between the UK and the EU in the long run. And two, that story is very much still in the making. And obviously we're not in a comfortable place right now, but I think that structurally and historically, and if you look at the opportunities for the future for both Europe and the UK, there is everything auguring towards figuring out ways to have sustainable, ongoing, deep collaboration and coordination between the two in the long run. And it's obviously going to take more negotiation and reconciliation in some parts of, in some places before that happens. But I expect that 10 years, 20 years from now, there will be some deep functional cooperation and coordination.
That's optimistic, given the way it's going right now between Britain and the EU, anyway. Anything you want to add on Brexit?
No,
made NATO more important in a way? At least for the Brits.
At least for the Brits, yes. I would agree on this. I mean, the doors for cooperation between the European Union and the UK certainly are open. We have lots of difficulties with them, as you can see in the press, but usually these are things about trade and stuff, which is also important. But I cannot detect for the moment any difficulties in defense posture, strategic thinking about security policy. And yes, we have NATO, in which we cooperate with the UK in the same vein as we did before. But I would agree it's first and foremost, for the time being at least, a question Great Britain has to answer for itself, which way it will be going. What does the concept of global Britain actually means? And I think they are underway to develop this. I don't think they are still there yet, that they have defined that role for themselves. But the UK certainly will always have a strong transatlantic link with Washington, which they always had. And even though they will not be, and they are not anymore members of the European Union, they will still have a strong link to Europe. and vice versa. So.
Another question from the audience?
Thanks very much. Tori Holt from the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College and a distinguished fellow at Stimson in Washington. I want to go back to family money briefly. It's a great analogy.
So do I. Oh, you mean as a concept, okay.
And ask you about, in Washington, in the United States, we're very conscious of the risks to our own democracy. Not just January 6th, but election laws being changed at the state level and some real uncertainty about where that's taking us. Freedom House recently came out with a big study and said for the US, which prioritizes 3 Ds, diplomacy, development, defense, we should add a 4th, which is democracy. In some ways, this is common sense, but in other, it is not necessarily something that we have prioritized both domestically and internationally. So I'm curious, if the base of our alliance is a rules-based order, is shared values, and a helpful squabble over what that looks like in real world, what is that agenda from your point of view, sir, here in Europe and with NATO in particular, which is a values-based alliance, and also, Dan, your perspective, both from the US and being here in Europe as an ambassador. Thank you.
Me? I fundamentally believe that, yes, the rules-based international order, democracy, the values we share, is the bedrock of this alliance and continues to be that way. That does not exclude, of course, domestic developments in a democracy, be it the United States or be it Germany. I mean, we certainly also have our domestic debates in Europe, rising populism and all of this. But this is the core value, and if that core value is damaged, I think then we have a problem. That would be a fundamental problem. If we do not share the same values anymore, or if we do not share the rules-based order in our understanding, because we have the same understanding of the rules-based order, and as I said, for me, that's the bedrock of our transatlantic relationship, and this is the family treasure and value. If that is being somehow lost in Las Vegas casino, then we are in trouble.
I think, I think it's the hardest challenge of the moment that we're living in, to not become cynical. Because the moment we do that, we've lost. And to me, the question is, are we committed to democratic values and to the practice of democracy as an ideological commitment, or as an overlapping moral and empirical set of claims? And if the latter, then first of all, there is no alternative but continuing to fight for it, and fight is maybe to agitate for it, to be in a movement for it that is ongoing. There's no moral alternative to doing that. There is no morally tolerable form of cynicism. And there's also reason for hope and confidence that in the long run, as people realize that other solutions don't work, this is the one that will work for giving different people with different senses of where they derive meaning and different senses of identity the prospect to have a peaceful and prosperous future together. And I guess I derive some hope out of looking back a century when there was, both internationally and domestically and in the United States, a different but another round of populism that arguably was caused by some similar forces in terms of a rapidly changing economy that disrupted a lot of what people had held constant in previous generations, and that made people nervous about what the future holds. And in the end, we got through that, and I hope we'll get through this. But I share your sense that it is urgent and terrifying to watch the longest successful democracy on earth struggle with fundamental questions about whether people should be purposefully denied the right to vote, or to listen to the leader of such a nation deride and denigrate the role of a free press in a democracy, or criticize judges in what is, by all accounts a truly independent judiciary, which is no, kind of coincidence or kind of random thing, but a truly precious one. So I don't dismiss the gravity of the situation. I don't think we have any choice but to continue to push back against threats to it and to fight forward. And I hope that it's not misplaced confidence to trust that we are all still working for Immanuel Kant in some way, and that the best world that we can work for is one that has some form of rights respecting democracy domestically in entities that are also use those values as the basis for their interactions with each other.
All of your descriptions could also be talking about Hungary or Poland on the EU side, and they are starting to take measures. They are really, starting to say this is unacceptable.
It's deeply, and I mean, I'm glad that the EU is starting to take measures, and I guess it's very sad to watch two countries. I mean, Poland was the poster example of a democratic transition, and to watch so soon people dismantle key aspects of that democratic transition, which did bring prosperity, which did deliver, to watch people dismantle that is truly heartbreaking. And yes, I think it's on all of us to continue to work both within our own societies and also when we see friends falling back, to be honest with them, blunt when necessary, and to try to lift them back up to continue the race.
Interestingly, Tori, though, you said NATO is a value-based organization. It is. It's in the NATO Founding Act, but those kind of things aren't discussed. Those kind of things aren't discussed at NATO. The democracy deficit is not something that comes up unless we force them to talk about it. Anyway, just an aside. I understand there may be a question in the last row, and this is all we have time for. Is there somebody who would like to ask? Somebody was just scratching and raising their hand a little. No?
I have a question.
Please? Okay.
The question was about the UK, so...
Okay, great. Well, then we got it. Okay, one in the front row, and then that's all we're going to have time for.
Hi, my name is Nick. I work for Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur from the U.S. Congress. I wanted to shine a light quickly on Ukraine, which we sort of touched on a little bit, which is, if folks know, near and dear to my boss's heart. The question is specifically, a lot of folks will say the Minsk, the Normandy format has stalled. Some might say I wouldn't say this, but some might say it's dead, in a case where the Russians can't come to the table. And even where a case where the Ukrainians used a Turkish drone and very effectively neutralize a Russian artillery site, and are sort of criticized for it here in Paris and Berlin and elsewhere for protecting their own territory. So I'm curious, as we look at new voices, new ideas, how do we inject new opportunity to try to figure out how to solve the situation in Ukraine? Thank you.
You guys are on the Normandy. You guys are in the Normandy format.
I think I will be again disappointed because I have no new ideas. I don't see any other framework other those that we have at our disposal for the time being, which is disappointing because, as you know, Germany and France have undertaken another attempt just recently to put back a meeting on the meeting of the Normandy format on the list. So far, we haven't been successful. What is frustrating about these kind of frameworks is if you don't have a real alternative, and I don't see any, because I don't believe that there is a military solution to that conflict. You sometimes have to, have your 30 minutes of frustration, but continue to work in this framework. There is also a readiness, which we welcome, on the side of the U.S. administration also to play a more active role in that framework. But so far, also this has not produced any results as of yet, I certainly hope that this will be the case, and otherwise we will just simply, consistently, insistingly try to get the Minsk format going again, because as I said, it may be extremely disappointing to you because we are talking about new ideas. That certainly is not a new idea. We simply don't have any other.
Will the U.S. administration appoint a new special envoy for Ukraine?
I don't know if it's their intention to appoint a new special envoy for Ukraine. I think they would. I would guess that they would very much welcome joining the Normandy format and bringing, well, because frankly, we've let France and Germany try, and you know, it might have worked, but it hasn't worked. So one way to shake things up is to actually bring new actors to the table. And by the way, Ukraine has no better friend in the U.S. Congress than Congresswoman Chapter. You know, I think it's time for creative ideas on this. The problem is that anybody who puts one forward will be shot down by various other sides. I think it's time to talk about what a UN role could look like at some point. And it has to be one that Ukraine wants. But I think it's time to talk about that. I think the United States, France, and Germany should be talking much more seriously about how to raise the cost now on Putin for the continued presence of Russian operatives, whether formally or mercenaries, on Ukraine's territory. And there are things that could be done to raise those costs, both politically and militarily. And I think the objective of the conversations, at least among allies, should be to think about how can we separate. Obviously, you know, the intention is to keep the tail that can wag the Ukrainian dog. How do we separate the tail from the dog in political impact without separating the tail from doing anything that actually separates the tail from the dog? And in that respect, one of the things that we can do is redouble our efforts to stem the backsliding on democratic institutions and values in Kyiv as well, and to support Ukrainian civil society and the number of patriotic Ukrainians who are working in their government trying to make a full fully free and democratic Ukraine a reality, to redouble our efforts there. It is still something that I remember, that the only place in the world where people have died carrying an EU flag is on the Maidan in Kyiv. Those values, European values, they are universal values. They are also American values, and they speak to people everywhere. And you can't have a project that you say is open to everyone, and then have people say, we believe in the project that you're building, and not have an answer for them. We have to have an answer for them. We can't stop having an answer for them, and it will take a long time, but we have to remain committed to that idea.
Well, that's a great place to end on a new idea. We should have actually gotten also to climate change, which is a place where there can be a lot of new ideas at NATO and at the EU. And this is certainly answering the new voices with concern about that. But we are running out of time, so we can continue that conversation here in the room with our guests here. Thank you to all of you who joined online. You can continue the conversation online at #SecTalkFES. And thank you again. This is going to be a continuing series of discussions, and we hope you'll join us again. Thank you to all of you for being here from the United States. Good night.